They said Richie the Boot never raised his voice, even when he gave an order that ended a man's life. Maybe that's what made him more dangerous than all the loud ones. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more true stories from the dark side of American history. Richie was born in 1890s Naples, a narrow street, laundry lines above, and whispers of survival below. His father was a dock worker with hands like broken bricks. His mother prayed over every meal, but even she knew prayers didn't feed the hungry. When the Boiardo family crossed the ocean and landed in Newark, New Jersey, the boy carried only one thing from the old country: the habit of listening. He'd sit in the corner of the grocery where men whispered in dialects about debts, favors, and respect. Richie never interrupted. He just listened and remembered. By 16, he already understood something grown men didn't. Power wasn't about who shouted the loudest. It was about who controlled the silence. And soon, that silence would start to make him rich. By the time Richie turned 20, Newark had changed, but not for the better. Immigrants crowded tenements, crime brewed in alleyways, and everyone was looking for a way out of poverty. Richie, always quiet, found his. He opened a small produce stand on Bloomfield Avenue. On paper, he sold fruit. In truth, he sold trust. He'd hand a man an apple, and along with it, a favor. "Pay me when you can," he'd say, his voice calm, his eyes unreadable. People remembered that tone. It wasn't kindness, it was control wrapped in courtesy. By the late 1920s, when Prohibition hit, that same produce stand became something else: a front for liquor, loans, and introductions. Richie had built his own small kingdom, not with bullets, but with balance. He treated his men like family, but expected silence and loyalty in return. He'd tell them, "If you speak, speak truth. If you lie, lie for me." And they did. Still, those close to him said he had a strange habit. Every night, before locking his shop, he'd wipe his hands clean and whisper in Italian, "Niente è gratis, nothing is free." He wasn't warning others. He was reminding himself. But soon, others would learn that lesson the hard way. The streets of Newark in the early 1930s smelled of rain, bootleg whiskey, and ambition. The Great Depression hit hard, but not everyone was suffering. Richie the Boot was thriving. He saw opportunity where others saw despair. While men lined up for bread, Richie lined up investments, speakeasies, construction fronts, and gambling parlors tucked behind legitimate businesses. He wasn't the kind of man who fought for turf with guns. He fought with favors. A city official needed campaign money. Richie provided it. A judge needed silence about a family scandal. Richie provided that too. Each favor was another thread in a web only he understood. One night, in a smoky backroom above a bakery, Richie poured himself a glass of bootleg bourbon and told his right-hand man, "You can build fear with bullets, but you can only build respect with time." That philosophy made him untouchable. The local cops looked away, the politicians looked grateful. Even the other crime families in New York began to take notice of the quiet man from New Jersey. By the time most men were trying to survive, Richie had already built an empire. But power invites attention, and the louder Newark grew, the more the silence around Richie began to whisper his name. By the 1940s, Richie the Boot wasn't just a gangster, he was an institution. His mansion in Livingston stood like a fortress, complete with statues, marble floors, and a private chapel he used more than any church in Newark. He wasn't pretending to be legitimate anymore, he was legitimate, at least on paper. Construction companies, trucking firms, waste management, all stamped with the Boiardo name. But those who knew him closely said he still lived by one rule: control everything, but never show it. He'd stroll through his neighborhood every Sunday morning, tipping his hat to shopkeepers, handing out cash to widows, and kissing babies on the cheek. To the people, he was Mr. B. To his men, he was Il Capo Vecchio, the old boss. One evening, during dinner, his son Anthony asked, "Pop, you think we'll ever go legit?" Richie smiled, slowly carving his steak. "Son," he said, "legit is just a word rich men use for crime they can afford." He ruled through balance, part businessman, part philosopher, all power. Even the 5 families across the Hudson treated him with respect. But as his empire expanded, so did the cracks beneath it, small, invisible, and deadly. And Richie? He could already feel the ground starting to shift. Every empire looks solid from the outside, until loyalty starts to rot it from within. By the mid-1950s, Richie's calm rule faced its first real tremor. Younger men in his crew, men raised in post-war America, didn't understand his old world ways. They wanted speed, not silence, more guns, more cash, more chaos. Whispers started in the bars of Newark. Some said Richie was too soft, others claimed he was keeping the best deals for himself. He ignored it at first, he'd survived worse storms. But when a shipment went missing from the docks and 2 of his men vanished with it, he knew it wasn't coincidence. That night, Richie sat alone in his study, under the dim light of a single lamp. He poured wine, crossed himself, and whispered, "Tradimento non dormi, betrayal never sleeps." The next morning, one of the missing men turned up in the Passaic River. The message was clear. The boot still fit, and it still kicked hard. But something inside him had changed. For the first time in decades, Richie didn't feel in control. He started to trust less, talk less, and sleep even less. And somewhere, in a dull government office, a new kind of enemy had just written his name on a file marked organized crime. By the late 1950s, the world had caught up with Richie the Boot. The FBI was no longer a rumor, it was a shadow that followed him everywhere. Agents sat in parked cars outside his mansion, pretending to read newspapers. Phones clicked when lifted. Strangers asked too many questions. Richie would still attend weddings, church fundraisers, and union dinners, but he no longer smiled the same way. His eyes searched every face. He started holding meetings outdoors, by his garden fountain, where the running water masked his words. Never trust the walls, he'd tell his son Anthony. They have ears now. The Bureau had new weapons, wiretaps, informants, secret deals. And for the first time, Richie faced something he couldn't outthink or outspend, the American government's patience. Every day, he'd receive coded notes from his men, who was followed, who was questioned, who might have flipped. He burned each one in his fireplace without a word. But paranoia has a cost. The man who once built an empire on silence now found that same silence haunting him. He'd sit alone at night, listening to the wind through the trees, convinced it carried whispers. And deep down, he knew the walls really were closing in. It didn't happen with a shootout or a raid. Richie's fall came quietly, almost politely. In 1969, a former associate turned government witness. His name never made headlines, but his words did. He spoke for 47 hours straight, naming deals, fronts, and the old man who ran Newark like a private kingdom. When the papers hit the stands, Richie's name was everywhere. Mafia Kingpin of New Jersey, the headlines screamed. He didn't flinch. He just folded the newspaper, placed it beside his espresso, and said, "They finally spelled my name right." The FBI arrived days later. No struggle, no cuffs in the street, just a calm surrender. He knew better than to fight the inevitable. The agents found files, coded ledgers, and even photos of meetings that had taken place years ago. The empire he built on whispers had been undone by someone else's voice. In court, Richie stayed composed. The prosecutor tried to provoke him, but he never raised his eyes. When asked if he had anything to say, he replied softly, "Your Honor, I'm just an old man who believed in keeping his word." The judge gave him life. Richie nodded once, like a man signing his own history. And as they led him away, someone whispered, "The boot finally got stepped on." But Richie wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. Prison didn't break Richie the Boot, it merely slowed his rhythm. He adjusted the way he always had, with silence. The guards called him sir, the younger inmates called him boss. He never asked for favors, never raised his voice. He'd rise before dawn, polish his shoes, and read the same Bible he used to keep in his office. Routine keeps the soul steady, he told another inmate once. Even when the walls close in. He spent hours walking the prison yard, eyes fixed on the sky instead of the fence. Men would approach him, hungry for power, desperate for advice. Richie would just smile. "You want power?" he'd say. "Learn to wait." Letters from the outside came less often. The old crew had scattered. His son Anthony was trying to keep the family business alive, but Richie knew the world was changing, new players, new rules, no honor. At night, when the lights dimmed, he'd trace the scar on his hand, a reminder from a fight half a century ago, and whisper to himself, "Loyalty, that's the only sentence that never ends." And though the walls were high, he still felt bigger than them. Because even in confinement, Richie ruled something no cell could touch, time itself. But time, like loyalty, eventually runs out. By the time Richie walked out of prison, the world no longer recognized him. Newark had traded corner bars for skyscrapers, and the streets he once ruled now belonged to strangers with cell phones instead of switchblades. He was an old man now, stooped but sharp-eyed, living quietly in his mansion in Livingston, the same one he built when power seemed eternal. The fountains were dry, the statues cracked, but the silence felt familiar. Every morning, he'd sit on the porch with his espresso, watching the sun crawl over his empty driveway. "Used to be cars lined up here," he'd murmur. "Now it's just ghosts." Young reporters tried to reach him. "Mr. Boiardo, do you regret anything?" one asked once, shouting over the gate. Richie didn't answer. He just lifted his cup slightly, a silent toast to everything he'd gained, and everything he'd lost. But even in his final years, he kept one habit. Every Sunday, he'd attend Mass, sit in the last pew, and leave an envelope in the donation box, no name, just cash. Old ways die slow. He'd lived through bullets, betrayals, and the FBI, but time was the only enemy that never missed. And it was finally catching up. In his final years, Richie the Boot stopped talking about business altogether. What once filled his life, power, loyalty, fear, had faded into something quieter. He'd sit by his window each evening, a wool blanket over his legs, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes past the iron gates. Sometimes he'd smile, sometimes he'd mutter, "They'll never know who lived here." One night, his caretaker found him in his study, a single lamp glowing, an untouched glass of wine on the table. Beside it lay a note written in his trembling hand. "I built a kingdom out of silence, but in the end, silence was all that stayed." They buried him in a private mausoleum he'd prepared decades earlier, marble walls, family crest, and a stone inscription that read simply, "Honor never dies." Today, those who remember him still argue, was he a gangster, a philosopher, or a ghost of another America? Maybe he was all three. Because Richie the Boot outlived the world he built, not because he was lucky, but because he never broke his word. Speech Balloon, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more true gangster stories like this one.